Before creating Season 1 of House of the Dragon, Ryan Condal received three pretty small requests from the author of the book series, George R. R. Martin. One of these, and my favorite among them, is the request for bright and colorful heraldry. In Game of Thrones, we'd see the same sigils over and over again, and they grew increasingly dull as the seasons wore on. In the books, I believe there are approximately 5 trillion houses, and each of these houses has different heraldry and words. Some of them don't have words, but overall, this is a massive font of world building that the show just missed out on entirely. I've talked in the past about a number of characters that were cut from the show, but by cutting these houses, it effectively cuts a bunch of characters, insofar as there were a lot of interesting characters from these minor houses who the showrunners really thought, oh, we don't really know much about their families, we don't want to get into all that, let's just cut them and just give their arcs to more major characters. Today I'm going to be talking about my favorite of the cut houses from Game of Thrones, that being House Connington, as I believe that they are unlikely to appear in House of the Dragon, and I do think they have some interesting history and interesting roles in the main series. I've talked at length about Jon Connington, one of their members who's a viewpoint character in the past and present and likely future, but today I'm going to focus on the history of the house as a whole, Connington's role as a parallel to that history, and his other family members who are currently alive, including one fairly important knight who we haven't discussed before. The Connington sigil is now on screen before you. Behold its glory. Honestly, A Song of Ice and Fire has a ton of really cool sigils. I'm partial to House Brax's Purple Unicorn personally, but Connington has always been one of my favorites. The contrasting, dueling red and white griffins are really interesting, and it is a mythological creature that we don't hear a ton about in the series outside of this specific sigil. Griffins are referenced in reference to House Connington and really not much else, but it does make sense that there could be some equivalent to them, at least in the myths and histories of the world of Ice and Fire, as we do know that places like Valyria and like an island off of Sithorios, whose name I'll put on screen because I forget how to pronounce it, have a history in like combining humans and animals to create these kind of half beast monstrosities, which is what a griffin is. Tyrion specifically thinks of it as a winged lion, as he remarks on this immediately upon meeting Jon Connington, despite Jon Connington being incognito. We also don't quite know the words of House Connington. We think they're a griffin, as Connington remarks that that is a battle cry of the house, but it's unclear if that's just a battle cry or the words of this family. It's been a minute since I've done one of these videos breaking down the history of a house in A Song of Ice and Fire. Which house do you think I should cover next? Be sure to let me know in the comments down below. When you're down there, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. I really appreciate it. It's free and it really helps grow the channel. Let's get back into House Connington. We do know that House Connington used to be a lot more important than it is in the modern day A Song of Ice and Fire story. They were rulers of a large swath of the Stormlands, though it's unclear as to whether or not they were kings of that area. It doesn't sound like it, as House Durrandon, the precursor to House Baratheon, were noted to be kings of that area. They are noted as falling in line with Targaryens. There's really no mention of them during the conquest. The first mentions of them begin to crop up during the early rule of Aegon I, however. During the First Dornish War, one of the lords of House Connington was killed by assassins. This was a part of essentially the period of Fire and Blood that is remarked on, essentially the Targaryens losing ground in Dorne. Aegon goes in, burns most of the sands for the death of his sister, and then puts a bunch of Stormland and Reach lords in charge of everything, and those lands start giving back to the Dornish, and those lords start dying right quick. Unfortunately, Lord Connington is one of many who end up dying here. I actually talk about similar things in the House Uller videos. Another lord is killed in the Hell Halt. We have three more mentions of House Connington in Fire and Blood, and all three of these mentions have some sort of historic parallel to what is currently going on in A Song of Ice and Fire, which I'll talk about a little bit later in this video once I've gone over what is actually happening currently. First and foremost, we hear that the Lord Connington at the time, we don't have a first name, joined Prince Aegon the Uncrowned in his fight against his uncle Maegor, who had seized the throne from him as he was disposed at the time with his wife and without his dragon. This was a massive battle that resulted in Aegon's death. The Conningtons were on the losing side there, unfortunately, but we don't hear of any consequences to them as a response to it. I think because Maegor kind of had his hands full with many other things that he was doing and killing. Lord Kyle Connington is another one. I tweeted about this when I was rereading Fire and Blood this past month, but he started the tradition of crushing on Targaryens quite early, as he's present for Jaehaerys' wedding, and specifically remarks that, oh, Prince Jaehaerys is so clever and so funny. I imagine he's flipping his hair while he does this. And additionally, we do know that another member of House Connington, that being the young Lord Roy Connington, was one of the companions of Princess Sarah Targaryen, who ended up wrapped up in her scandal. He did not get off of it the worst, insofar as he was not executed by the king in a duel, as the stinger, Beesbury, was, but he was essentially going to be forced to marry one of Sarah's handmaidens who was pregnant. He alleged that the daughter was not his, so he elected to spend 10 years in exile in Essos instead, where he soon died. So, poor guy. Actually, he didn't die soon. That was a mismemory on my part. I believe he only had a few months left in his exile, and then he died, which, I mean, kind of the worst way to die in exile. I should also mention the one commonality we hear throughout every Connington mentioned in the historical record, that we have details on at least. They all have red hair. This is a fairly notable feature, as Martin's genetics seems to be a bit more kind of simplistic than what we have, but the seed is strong, as many say, and it seems like the fiery hair is very strong in terms of how it is passed down. It's worth noting that the daughter that was denied by young Lord Roy Connington actually ended up having red hair, so it's likely that she was his daughter and he sent himself into exile for no reason. So, great decision by House Connington, as we'll see, becomes a trend for them. The only other historical member we have is not really related to anything else, so we actually don't even know when he lived, but Jaime references in Storm of Swords someone on the Kingsguard who is known as the Pale Griffin, Alan Connington, which, I mean, Alan's one of my favorite of Martin's names, the Alyn, like Alan of Hull, and it's neat, and it's cool to see that one of them served on the Kingsguard. It was unclear exactly which king that would be. If I had to guess, it would be sometime after the Dance of the Dragons, given that we have pretty extensive records of the Kingsguard before then, but that would still just be a guess, so who knows? I hope you can't hear that it just started raining very hard partway through my recording, but we're going to press on. Going into the era of Robert's Rebellion, the Lord at the time is Lord Armand Connington, which is a fun and interesting name that I hadn't really heard in A Song of Ice and Fire. He always essentially was striving to get more, and he had Rhaegar, the prince at the time, visit his castle and essentially try to get Rhaegar to take his side in a conflict against House Morrigan, who we know has somebody on the Kingsguard at some point in history. I believe it's earlier on in history. Giles Morgan was the famous Lord Commander of Jaehaerys' Kingsguard. However, this is remembered by Jon Connington not because of Rhaegar ending this dispute, but because Rhaegar and Jon Connington stood on the ramparts of his father's lands and looked out on them, and it was very romantic and very nice. Going forward from this area, we know that Jon Connington and Rhaegar grew up together in King's Landing as squires and were quite close. He was not named to the Kingsguard, but we do know that Jon Connington did have a lot of love for Rhaegar Targaryen, as we can tell from his perspectives in A Dance with Dragons. It's also worth noting that during this era, young Jon Connington attends the tourney at Harrenhal, which is currently being turned into a stage play. So it seems likely that the first adaptation of House Connington might not be on screen, but it might be on stage, which is pretty neat. I'm a fan of it. Jon Connington's relationship with Rhaegar gets him placed into a position of power and a bit of peril as well. Given the fact that Rhaegar goes off to the Tower of Joy with Lyanna, and Aerys' hand, Lord Merryweather, was very incompetent, he was looking to replace him with Rhaegar, but having his son be absent, he thought that Jon Connington would be the next best thing. Connington then really wanted to make a name for himself, so he ran off and did an event that came to be known as the Battle of the Bells. This incident involved young Lord Robert Baratheon, the main perpetrator of this rebellion, for which it would later be named. He was hidden and injured in this town called Stony Sept. It's in the kind of center of Westeros, and it is a fairly important town that people seem to keep walking through. Throughout this battle, Connington was going from house to house and attempting to locate Robert Baratheon as he was being shuffled around by the townspeople, as he was quite beloved at this point, and the Targaryens are known to be quite mad, or at least Aerys II is. This battle ends with Jon Connington essentially going on a mad tear. He actually ends up killing Jon Arryn's brother at this point, and it is interesting talking about the fact that, like, I was rereading Feast for Crows recently, and they're talking about the succession crisis in the Eyrie, with Sweet Robin having Harry the heir, his very distant cousin, as his heir, and that succession crisis is caused by Jon Connington at the Battle of the Bells, which is quite interesting. But as all of these bells are ringing, Jon Connington fights and loses to Robert Baratheon. I've always thought it's very impressive that he doesn't die to Robert Baratheon, but that's neither here nor there. But overall, this does end up being a defeat for Connington. He is soon exiled by the Mad King, and many of his lands and titles are stripped from him, leaving House Connington a mere house of landed knights by the time the main series begins. In the main series, the primary Connington we interact with through the first few books is not Jon Connington. It's a man named Ronnet Connington. Red Ronnet, he's called. He's the same title as one of his ancestors, as the red hair tends to give that title. And we meet him first in A Clash of Kings, and then he resurfaces in A Feast for Crows. He's a pretty interesting character, and I think that despite Jon being the more important cut from the show, I think cutting Ronnet was also a bad decision. Ronnet is initially introduced, as I said, in A Clash of Kings, as he is with King Renly Baratheon's host, who later switches to Stannis and then later switches to Joffrey. He survives the Battle of the Blackwater and essentially bends the knee, so he's at this point bended his knee 2 times over. Bent his knee, not bend it. I promise I know tenses correctly. Ronnet Connington is kind of a dick when we meet him in Feast for Crows from Jaime's perspective, as we learn that he was one of the suitors of Lady Brienne of Tarth. Brienne is obviously known to not be the prettiest, despite her title, Brienne the Beauty, and Red Ronnet Connington, continually insulted her throughout their courting and gave her a rose, and essentially told her that that was all she'd ever get from him. He's then a dick about it again when he meets Jaime, and this results in Jaime slapping him with his golden hand. It's actually similar to what happened to one of the Freys in the show, so that incident was at least a little adapted, but overall, Red Ronnet Connington, I'm going to keep that part in just to keep myself honest, is still an interesting character. It's also worth noting that he is a pretty big focus of the last chapter we have of the main series as of this recording. The beginning of Kevin's epilogue features Red Ronnet asking for leave to go hunt down his cousin Jon after Jon has taken the castle of Griffin's Roost in the Stormlands, as Jon is spreading rumors about what's happening to his family members, and Red Ronnet is pissed, as he does seem to be pretty quick to anger based on our interactions with him so far. There is another theory that I'd be remiss to not mention that I recently stumbled across in researching this video, and I like it quite a bit. It's by a guy who actually comments on this channel quite a bit. His name is InGen Nate Kenny, and he posted it to Reddit a few months ago. That being that Red Ronnet is kind of the best possible ally for Cersei. He outlines a number of reasons as to why in the post itself, which I will link in the description, but mainly the fact that he is in King's Landing, confined there, someone who is not aligned with the Reach, and in fact probably hates the Reach as a Stormlander, and he is someone who is not the brightest and could just overall be very helpful to Cersei in the near future. He has expressed that he wants to go help liberate his castle from Jon Connington. However, he is confined to the Red Keep by Kevin after that epilogue meeting that I mentioned, and it does seem like he'll have to stick around and be near Cersei towards the beginning of the Winds of Winter. So I could see him helping around, I could see her counseling him, or vice versa, or I could see him being appointed to the Kingsguard with the excess of slots that currently exist. It's often funny how Martin has certain characters or families repeat the same events or thoughts or actions over time, and we see that in House Connington specifically, as there are a few pretty interesting occurrences of it. Specifically, if we're flashing back to Roy Connington, the companion of Sarah, who I talked about initially, like Ronnet, his distant ancestor, he also refused a match that was made for him. Additionally, both him and Jon Connington were exiled after a scandal involving a crown prince or not crown princess of the Targaryen line, and both of them supposedly died in exile. And also, as I joked earlier, the previous Lord Connington, Kyle Connington, continues the Jon Connington trend of crushing on Targaryen princes or kings. I think this is pretty fun, and I really enjoy it, and I am quite interested to see how Ronnet interacts with Jon Connington should they come to face off in the Battle of Steel, which I do think is quite likely, as Martin often loves doing these family confrontations as climactic parts of arcs of both main and side characters like Jon and Ronnet respectively. One final point that's worth noting is that House Connington is very well stationed for advancement at this point. I'm not going to touch much on John Connington. I've done that a lot in other videos that you can watch on this channel, but I think that given the fact that he is so close to Aegon's camp, he is the hand of the king to this new potential Targaryen monarch, and the fact that all of the Baratheons are dead or, sorry, Stannis likely dying, it seems likely that they'll need a new kind of Lord Paramount of the Stormland, so I could very much see House Connington being raised to that station, especially should some of Red Ronnet's family survive, given that John Connington doesn't have any kids, and he's not likely to sire any, given that he's gay and has grayscale. So why is House Connington the best house in Game of Thrones that was cut from Game of Thrones? Well, it's because they're my favorite. I'm sure you have a favorite house as well. I'd love to cover more kind of obscure families in this series, so let me know what I should do next. I'd really appreciate any guidance there, and I hope you enjoyed this house history as much as I did, though, I mean, hopefully not. This is my 10th video on John Connington related to him, so, man, that's a lot. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. I'll do many more videos on A Song of Ice and Fire in the near future. Now that House of the Dragon's done, we are back on the book train, baby, so we're going to keep going. I'm excited to share more with you. I have a video I'm currently researching that I'm very excited about. It involves all of the Greyjoy point of views, and I'm very excited to continue researching it. And I hope you'll stick around and subscribe so you can see it. While you're doing that, leave a like, comment, all that typical YouTube stuff that helps the channel. And yeah, thank you again for your support, and I will see you in the very near future. Goodbye, everyone.